The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Willowbrook, but 17-year-old Thomas couldn't feel its warmth. His hands were bound behind his back, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, but the words seemed to come from somewhere far away. "Fine young man here, folks. Strong back, willing to work. Bidding starts at $50. Thomas had never imagined his life would come to this. Just 3 months ago, he'd been living peacefully with his grandmother in their small cabin on the outskirts of town. She'd raised him since he was 5, after his parents died in a wagon accident crossing the river. Grandma May had been everything to him. Mother, father, teacher, and friend rolled into one weathered but loving woman. But the fever had taken her quickly, and with her passing, Thomas discovered the crushing weight of debt she'd hidden from him. The bank wanted their money, and when Thomas couldn't pay, they'd arranged for him to be sold into indentured servitude. 7 years of his life, they said, to work off what was owed. The crowd was a mix of farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk, all eyeing him like livestock. Thomas kept his gaze fixed on the ground, shame burning his cheeks. He'd never even kissed a girl, had spent his 17 years helping his grandmother with her small garden and reading the few books she owned. Now he was being sold like a horse or a plow. $60, called out Jake Morrison, the meanest rancher in 3 counties. Thomas's stomach turned. He'd heard stories about Morrison's place, how he worked his hands near to death and fed them scraps. 70, shouted another voice. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to remember his grandmother's gentle hands braiding his hair when he was small, her voice singing lullabies that kept the nightmares away. If only she were here now. $100. The voice was different, softer, yet carrying a quiet authority that made the entire crowd turn. Thomas looked up for the first time since stepping onto the platform. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a woman he'd never seen before. She appeared to be in her 40s, though it was hard to tell with certainty. Her auburn hair was streaked with premature silver and pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with a dignity that made her seem almost regal. Her eyes, the deepest brown Thomas had ever seen, were fixed directly on him, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. 100 going once. ... The auctioneer called out, clearly surprised by the jump in bidding. Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. 120. The woman stepped forward slightly. 100. A murmur ran through the crowd. That was serious money in these parts, more than most folks saw in a year. Morrison cursed under his breath but didn't counter. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Sold to the lady. Thomas felt his legs go weak with relief. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than Morrison's ranch. The woman approached the platform as the auctioneer collected her payment. Up close, Thomas could see the kindness in her eyes, but also something else, a deep sadness that seemed to mirror his own. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said quietly as the sheriff unlocked Thomas's bonds. "I have a farm about 5 miles north of town. I hope you don't mind hard work." "No, ma'am," Thomas managed, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had chafed them. "I'm grateful for your kindness." She studied his face for a long moment. "We'll see if you still feel that way come winter. Let's go home." The ride to Eleanor's farm passed in comfortable silence. Thomas sat beside her on the wagon seat, stealing glances at her profile as she handled the reins with practiced ease. There was something about her that reminded him of his grandmother, not in appearance, but in the way she seemed to carry herself with quiet strength. The farm, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. A 2-story house with a wraparound porch sat surrounded by fields of corn and wheat. A red barn stood nearby, and Thomas could see chickens pecking in the yard. It looked like the kind of place a person could call home. "Your room is upstairs," Eleanor said as they pulled up to the house. "Second door on the right, suppers at 6, breakfast at sunrise. I expect an honest day's work, but I'm fair in my dealings." That first week passed quickly. Thomas threw himself into the farm work with desperate gratitude, determined to prove his worth. He mended fences, fed livestock, and helped bring in the late summer harvest. Eleanor worked alongside him most days, and Thomas was impressed by her knowledge and skill. She could shoe a horse, birth a calf, and calculate grain prices with equal expertise. But there were moments when he caught her staring off into the distance, with that same deep sadness he'd noticed at the auction. She never spoke of a husband, though Thomas noticed the faded ring mark on her finger and the single place setting she laid at the table each night. It was during his second week that Thomas first heard her crying. He'd risen early to check on a sick cow and was walking past the house when the sound drifted from an open window, soft, heartbroken sobs that made his chest ache. He wanted to knock on the door to offer comfort somehow, but he didn't know what he could possibly say. Instead, he stood in the yard for a long moment, listening to the sound of someone else's grief, before quietly walking to the barn. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. Thomas was repairing a section of fence when Eleanor approached, carrying a pitcher of cold water and 2 glasses. "Take a break," she said, settling onto a fallen log nearby. "This heat will kill a man if he's not careful." Thomas gratefully accepted. The water-in sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the endless prairie sky. "You remind me of someone," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice so quiet Thomas almost missed it. "Ma'am?" She was quiet for so long, Thomas wondered if she'd changed her mind about speaking. Finally, she turned to look at him, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "My son would be about your age now, if he'd lived." The words hung in the air between them like a prayer. Thomas felt his heart constrict with sympathy and understanding. What happened?" he asked gently. Eleanor's hands twisted, and her lap fever took him when he was 12. "Same fever that took my husband 2 years before that. I've been alone on this farm for 5 years now, Thomas. Some days I wonder why I keep going." Without thinking, Thomas reached out and covered her hands with his own. "I'm sorry. I lost my parents when I was young, and then my grandmother just passed. I know it's not the same, but I understand being alone." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, and Thomas suddenly realized how forward he was being. He started to pull away, but she held on. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's been so long since someone understood." From that day forward, something shifted between them. Their conversations grew longer and deeper. Eleanor began sharing stories of her late husband and son, while Thomas talked about his grandmother and the books she'd taught him to love. They discovered a shared passion for poetry and philosophy, spending evenings on the porch discussing everything from Emerson to the nature of grief. Thomas found himself looking forward to these talks more than anything else in his day. Eleanor was unlike any woman he'd ever known. Intelligent, strong, and surprisingly well-read for someone living so far from civilization. When she laughed at his awkward attempts at humor, his heart soared. When she looked at him with those deep brown eyes, he felt like he could conquer the world. But he was also increasingly aware of the growing feelings stirring in his chest, feelings that seemed both wonderful and terrifying. She was older than him, more experienced, and had shown him nothing but kindness when the world had been cruel. The last thing he wanted was to repay that kindness by making her uncomfortable with unwanted affections. The first snow came early. That year, blanketing the farm in pristine white, Thomas was chopping wood behind the house when he heard Eleanor call his name. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway, wrapped in a thick shawl. "Come inside," she said. "There's something I need to tell you." Thomas's heart sank. Had he done something wrong? Had she somehow sensed his growing feelings and decided to send him away? He followed her into the warm kitchen, where she gestured for him to sit at the small table. "I received a letter from the bank today," Eleanor began, and Thomas felt the bottom drop out of his world. "Your debt has been satisfied." Thomas stared at her, not comprehending. "Ma'am, the $150 I paid at the auction, plus the wages I've been setting aside for you each week, it's enough to clear what your grandmother owed. You're free, Thomas. Free to go wherever you choose." The words should have filled him with joy, but instead Thomas felt a crushing sense of loss. Free to go meant free to leave Eleanor, free to leave the only place that had felt like home since his grandmother died. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "The auctioneer said 7 years. The auctioneer was working for the bank, and the bank wanted their money. I've been paying them monthly installments." Eleanor's voice was carefully controlled, but Thomas could see the emotion she was trying to hide. "I thought you'd want to know as soon as possible." Thomas sat in stunned silence. Outside, the wind howled around the house and snowflakes danced past the window. He should be celebrating, planning his future, thinking about all the places he could go and things he could do. Instead, all he could think about was how empty the farm would feel without Eleanor's presence. "When do you want me to leave?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's facade cracked slightly. That's up to you. Could stay through the winter if you wanted. The weather's too harsh for travel now anyway." She turned away, busying herself with unnecessary tasks at the kitchen counter. "That's your choice, too." Make. That night, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his small room. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house, he could hear Eleanor moving around restlessly. He thought about all the places he could go California with. Its gold rush opportunities, the growing cities back east, the endless frontier stretching west. None of them appealed to him. The truth was simple and terrifying. He didn't want to leave Eleanor. Somewhere in the past few months, he'd fallen completely and hopelessly in love with her. Not just with her beauty, though she was beautiful in a way that took his breath away, but with her strength, her intelligence, her gentle spirit that had been wounded by loss, but not broken by it. But what could he possibly offer her? He was 18 years old with no money, no property, no prospects beyond the strength of his back and his willingness to work. She was an established landowner, a woman who'd been married and known real love. What would she want with a boyhood? Never even held a woman's hand? The answer, he decided, was nothing. The kindest thing he could do was leave in the spring and spare them both the awkwardness of his unrequited feelings. Winter deepened. The long evenings by the fire became both a joy and a torture for Thomas. Eleanor would sit in her rocking chair, mending clothes, or reading aloud from one of her books, while Thomas whittled or repaired tools. The domestic scene felt so natural, so right. Thomas could almost pretend they were a real family. But the pretense became harder to maintain. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself memorizing the way Eleanor's hair caught the firelight, the soft sound of her breathing when she dozed in her chair, the way she hummed under her breath while cooking. Every detail seemed precious, something to treasure when he was gone. Eleanor, for her part, seemed increasingly distant. She still spoke to him kindly, still worked alongside him during the day. But the easy intimacy they'd shared in the fall was gone. Thomas told himself it was natural. She was preparing for his departure just as he was. The crisis came in February, during the worst blizzard Thomas had ever seen. The snow piled up against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing trying to tear the house apart. They were trapped inside for 3 days. The world beyond their walls a swirling white void. On the second night, Eleanor was attempting to bank the fire when a log shifted and sparks flew out onto the floor. Her skirt caught fire before either of them could react. Eleanor. Thomas lunged forward, tackling her to the ground and rolling her away from the fireplace. He beat at the flames with his bare hands until they were extinguished, then held her close. Both of them breathing hard from the shock and fear. It was only then that Thomas realized the position they were in. Eleanor, beneath him on the floor. His arms wrapped around her, their faces inches apart. Her hair had come loose from its bun and spilled across the floor like liquid copper. Her eyes were wide with shock, but as they stared at each other, something else flickered in their depths. "Thomas," she whispered, and the way she said his name made his heart stop. Before he could think or reason or talk himself out of it, Thomas leaned down and kissed her. It was clumsy and desperate, and everything he'd dreamed it would be. For a moment, one perfect, impossible moment, Eleanor kissed him back. Then reality crashed down on them both. Eleanor pushed him away gently but firmly, sitting up and quickly pinning her hair back into place. "Thomas, we can't, I know," he said quickly, his face burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean yes, you did." Eleanor's voice was sad but not angry. "And so did I, that's the problem." Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis. "You did?" Eleanor stood and smoothed down her skirts, not meeting his eyes. "I think we should both get some sleep. We can pretend this never happened." They couldn't pretend, and they both knew it. The next day, the tension between them was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Eleanor spoke to him only when necessary, and Thomas found himself jumping at shadows, desperate to bridge the gulf that had opened between them, but not knowing how. That evening, as they sat by the fire in uncomfortable silence, Eleanor finally spoke. "I loved my husband very much," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "When he died, I thought I'd never feel that way about anyone again. And then my son died, and I was sure I'd never let myself care about anyone that deeply again. It hurt too much." Thomas waited, hardly daring to breathe. "But then you came here," Eleanor continued, "and slowly, without my realizing it, you became important to me. More important than I ever intended to let anyone become." "Eleanor," she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm 42 years old, Thomas. You're 18. People would talk, and they'd be right to talk. I'm old enough to be your mother." "You're not my mother," Thomas said fiercely. "And I don't care what people say. You should care. You have your whole life ahead of you. Could find a nice girl your own age, start a family, build a future. Why would you want to tie yourself to an old widow with nothing to offer but a failing farm and a broken heart?" Thomas stood abruptly, frustration and love and desperation all warring in his chest. "Because I love you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see the world. I love how you hum when you're cooking and how you argue with the characters in books like they can hear you. I love that you saved me not just from Morrison's ranch but from giving up on myself entirely." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, ... No, I'm young," he pressed on, "and I know I don't have much to offer. But I love you, Eleanor, and if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that age doesn't matter when two hearts are meant to be together." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, so quietly, Thomas almost missed it, she whispered, "I love you too." The words hung in the air between them like a miracle. Thomas took a tentative step toward her, then another, until he was close enough to see the tears on her cheeks. "Then why does it feel like you're pushing me away?" Eleanor reached out and touched his face gently. "Because I'm scared. I've lost everyone I've ever loved, Thomas. I couldn't bear to lose you too." "You won't lose me," Thomas said, covering her hand with his own. "I'm not going anywhere unless you send me away." "What? If you change your mind? What if you wake up one day and realize you've wasted your youth on an old woman? What if you wake up one day and realize you've wasted your time worrying about things that don't matter?" Thomas countered. "Eleanor, I've been alone most of my life. I know what loneliness feels like, and I know what love feels like too. This is love, real, honest, forever love. Don't throw it away because you're afraid of what might happen." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, as if memorizing every detail. Then, slowly, she smiled the first real smile Thomas had seen from her in weeks. "You're very wise for such a young man," she said. "I had a good teacher," Thomas replied, leaning down to rest his forehead against hers. "So what do we do now?" Eleanor said, "We stop letting fear make our decisions for us." This time, when Thomas kissed her, there was no hesitation, no pulling away. It was soft and sweet, and full of all the promises they were finally brave enough to make. The blizzard passed, and with it the last of winter's fury. As spring returned to the prairie, it brought new life, not just to the land, but to Thomas and Eleanor's relationship. They were careful at first, still mindful of the differences between them. But love has a way of overcoming even the most stubborn obstacles. Thomas proposed on Easter Sunday, presenting Eleanor with a ring he'd carved, from a piece of oxenwool but beautiful, like their love itself. Eleanor cried when she accepted, but they were tears of joy this time, not sorrow. The wedding was small, held in the little church in Willowbrook, with only a few close friends as witnesses. Some people whispered, as Eleanor had predicted they would, but most were kind. The preacher's wife commented that she'd never seen a bride glow quite so radiantly, and old Doc Morrison, Jake Morrison's much nicer father, declared that love was love, regardless of age. As they stood together at the altar, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. Thomas thought about the morning he'd stood on the auction block, certain his life was over. He'd had no way of knowing that the woman bidding on him wasn't buying a servant. She was saving the man who would become her husband, her partner, her greatest love. The years that followed were filled with the kind of happiness Thomas had never dared to dream of. They worked the farm together, built it into one of the most prosperous in the county. Eleanor taught Thomas to read Latin and Greek, while he taught her to play the harmonica his grandmother had left him. They had their struggles, failed crops, harsh winters, the occasional bout of illness, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. They were blessed with 2 children, a daughter they named May, after Thomas's grandmother, and a son they called Samuel, after Eleanor's first husband. Eleanor had worried she was too old to have children, but both pregnancies went smoothly, and she often marveled at the miracle of new life growing inside her when she'd thought that part of her life was over. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, Thomas and Eleanor would sit on their porch and remember that snowy February night when they'd finally admitted their love. They'd both learned that the heart doesn't measure love in years, it measures it in depth, in commitment, in the willingness to choose each other every single day. Thomas never regretted the path that had led him to Eleanor's farm. Even standing on that auction block, scared and alone, had been worth it for the life they'd built together. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just doorways to the best ones, disguised as endings when they're really beginnings. And if anyone ever suggested that their love was unusual or inappropriate, Eleanor and Thomas would simply smile and point to their thriving farm, their beautiful children, and the obvious joy that radiated from their every interaction. Love, they'd learned, isn't about fitting into other people's expectations. It's about finding the person who makes your soul feel at home. Years later, when Thomas was an old man with silver in his hair and lines around his eyes from decades of laughter, he would still remember that first moment he saw Eleanor at the auction. She'd bid on him thinking she was buying a farmhand, but what she'd really purchased was a future filled with more love and happiness than either of them had ever imagined possible. And Thomas, who had started that terrible day as a frightened boy about to be sold into servitude, had found something infinitely more valuable than freedom he'd found home.